Thanks, Dave. The OXO Good Grips vegetable peeler, Post-it notes, Toy Story, the Dyson DC-01 vacuum cleaner, and the complete works of Mark Twain. These things all have one thing in common, which is that they were all products of what I call selfish creativity. That means they were all made by people who wanted whatever it was they made to be in the world, whether they wanted to see it, to use it, to read it. And I kind of want to start reclaiming this word, selfish, which gets kind of a bad rap. Whether I'll be successful with that, I don't know, but I'll give it my best shot. So this is Sam and Betsy Farber in a kitchen, presumably sometime in the 80s, I guess. And Betsy Farber had, or has, I guess, mild arthritis in her hands, which means she can't grip the vegetable peeler that well because it's not broad enough for her. So she can't get a good enough grip on it. And Sam notices this. He's an industrial designer. And rather than just offer to help out with peeling the potatoes or the carrots or whatever, he decides to invent a new kind of vegetable peeler, which has a fatter handle, is easier to grip, which means he tries to get out of the peeling the vegetables, but fails because it's actually easier for him to use as well. And he builds a company called OXO Good Grips, which has over 800 products, all basically reinventing domestic utensils, which he sold about 15 years ago for $300 million or so. The guy on the left is Art Fry, and the guy on the right is Spencer Silver. And you may guess they've got something to do with the Post-it note from 3M. And a lot of people know the story of how they left messages for people around, on desks, and with the glue that doesn't stick, to leave phone numbers for people or phone messages. And then they started giving them around the office managers and receptionists to do the same, and that was when they decided to put the product on sale. But it actually all starts with an earlier product or an idea that solved a problem that Art Fry had with his hymn book. He used little scraps of paper to mark the pages for the hymns when he was in church on a Sunday, but of course they weren't secured in any way, so they would fall out and he would lose his page markings all the time. When he was at work, he saw Spencer Silver give a talk about this glue that he had invented that didn't form an adhesive bond, combined little scraps of paper with that glue, and the rest is history. This is now Sir James Dyson with his infamous vacuum cleaner. And again, in the late 70s, he bought what was supposed to be the state-of-the-art vacuum cleaner, and was incredibly frustrated with how quickly it clogged and stopped working, essentially. So he decided he would make a better one that didn't clog quite so easily, one that was actually a much more efficient, effective vacuum cleaner. It took him about 5,126 prototypes, but he got there in the end. And this is Brad Bird, who I'm sure many of you know is a film writer and director. He's made The Iron Giant, Ratatouille, The Incredibles. And this is a line about, specifically him talking about his work at Pixar, which is that everyone here loves films and they just want to make something that they themselves want to see. Basically, they tell themselves the stories that they want to be in the world. And I think Finding Nemo is one that's very much driven on that basis, where Andrew Stanton realized that there wasn't a story about a father and son story, essentially. And Pixar have had a pretty good track record, even including Cars 2. They've done all right for themselves over the years. And final example from non-games is Richard Saul Wurman, who is the guy who invented the TED conference. And I think this is particularly relevant because of a couple of things Dave's mentioned in his lead-ups to a couple of talks earlier, which is that he selected them because there were things he wanted to find out more about. And this is what Richard Wurman said about the TED conference. Basically, he's treating it as his dinner party, and other people find it interesting, great. If they don't, well, you'll give them their money back. I don't know if that's still true. And this is a line that really sort of kind of ties things together, I think, where people, there was a talk, Daniel Cook talked earlier about invention, and invention driving new categories and new genres for the games industry, which I think is completely true. But it's really luxury that drives that. The example, Henry Petrosky is a engineer and engineering historian, I guess. And this is from a book called Small Things Considered, and he's specifically talking about the invention of the fork here. But it really applies across many different things. So Dave had asked me to find some examples of how this applies to games products, and one of the first, and he probably wanted something that I didn't work on. So this was one of the first examples that sprang to mind, which, as it happens, is co-invented by a fellow Scot. But basically, Richard Tate was playing games one night with his family and friends, and he's really good at Pictionary, which was great because he won. But then they got onto Scrabble, and he lost because he's not very good at spelling, not very good at words. So basically, he wanted to invent a game that he could win, even though he would be rubbish at some of it, which is pretty selfish. Yep. This is a game I did work on. This is called Quaddle, and it's a mixture of Risk meets Scrabble. I worked on this at a company called Denki in Scotland. And this was really driven, the whole sort of seed of the idea was driven from, we want a word game that isn't like Scrabble, and that isn't like most other word games that we've played. So we basically invented a fast-paced action word game where you basically invade other people's territories, and the way you fight them is by making better words than them. And using Spryfox as an example, I spoke to Daniel before came out and asked him if this was something that he used in his projects and ideas. And I don't have the exact quote that he gave me, but it was definitely something that he agreed with in terms of selecting an idea that he really wanted to pursue and ultimately wanted to play what that idea would become. And on the flight over, I finally got around to watching Indie Game the movie, primarily in the hope that I would find some examples in there of selfish creativity. And lo and behold, Team Meat were talking about making the game that they wanted to play, and I think more specifically that their 13-year-old selves wanted to play. And this is an idea I've been sort of banding around for maybe 2 or 3 years now. And unbeknownst to me, Brandon Sheffield from Game Developer Magazine did a 5-minute talk at GDC earlier this year, where he talked about exactly this idea of making the games that you want to play. And one of the examples he used was Sword and Sorcery. And I think actually the fact that Brandon had this sort of idea separately from me, I've spoken to him about it now, but I hadn't previously. Sort of, again, it sums up the fact that we're not all unique and special snowflakes. The chances are that if we like something, that there are going to be other people out there who like that thing too. You just have to figure out how to find them. And Minecraft is another example Brandon used, and turns out 6.5 million or 7 million people wanted to pay to play the game that Notch wanted to play as well. But it's important to sort of point out that this is really a philosophy of how you go about producing something. There's still a large part of the problem to solve, I guess, which is how do you find that audience? How do you get distribution for that game? And the other thing that Dan from Spryfox pointed out was that he doesn't feel that it's selfish because he's sharing something with the world, something that he loves with the world, which is kind of awesome. And ultimately, I think the way we make unique and special snowflakes, the way we make great new games, great new genres, great new categories of games, is by assuming that there are other people out there like us. And I'm also not saying that you shouldn't use feedback. This is possibly the worst line of feedback I've ever seen. But the point is that you shouldn't use that to drive your design decisions. Sometimes it's good to use your judgment and good to use your opinion. And David Ogilvy has a quote about that from Confessions of an Advertising Man. And he's writing, can't remember when he wrote the book, in the late 60s, late 70s maybe, where he's talking about advertising executives using data basically to drive every single decision. And there was a question from the talk before about how do they balance pursuing an idea which they don't have any data to back up. And I think it really just comes down to knowing when to use it. There are a lot of authors, I mentioned Mark Twain at the start, there are a lot of authors who use this idea as the way that they write books. Stephen King, Chuck Palahniuk, J.K. Rowling all use a variation on write the book that you want to read. But this is an interesting one from Hilary Mantel, where she's saying that you can't write for a perceived market because it may have disappeared by the time you actually finish whatever it is that you're making. And Mark Twain, obviously famous for a lot of quotable lines, but my favorite is that he said, "I love a good story well told, which is why I'm sometimes forced to write them myself," which I think is just a perfect summation of exactly what we've been talking about for the last 20 minutes. Probably should just have said that at the start and left you to it. But I really think this is we've heard a lot about metrics today, and yes, they're important, but I think we also need to look at how we support the much broader audience that we have in the industry now, whether it's through what Nintendo do with the Wii and their devices, or the millions of new players that are coming in through Facebook. We need to create more content and have more diversity, and I think this is one way or one philosophy that can help drive that. So my question to you, before we get onto the Q&A for me, is what stories will you be forced to tell? Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Clearly explained it perfectly. Oh, sorry.
In your research with this, did you find any spectacular failures of this methodology?
Yes and no. It's hard to find failures for a specific thing because they don't become famous. Most of the games I've worked on are probably good examples of that. There's a reason you've never heard of me before. Yeah, I'm sure they are out there, but there are so many examples of this being used as something that builds an amazing product or builds an amazing company that it's kind of hard for me to ignore. Yep.
In your experience and research, do you find that something that is different and original really probably has to be self-funded? Because you pointed out that a lot of people just want to base everything on metrics and it will be successful and they don't want to take risks.
So the question is, if I've heard you right, my hearing's not great, but does everything need to be self-funded if you use this philosophy, or?
Yeah, just because you were pointing out that people are reluctant to take risks and they're basing everything on numbers and metrics and they want proof of success before they'll sign a check.
Sure, I think if you can do that, then yeah, it's always going to be easier to do that. But Pixar made Toy Story with Disney's money, so it can work the other way as well. No more? All right, thank you very much.